Good afternoon, good evening, good morning. I'm in Germany at the moment. It's evening for me. I think it's just about good afternoon for most of you. I delivered the Oslo Study. It's starting to become a little bit famous. So what I'd like to do is talk you through it and how we use the study to measure the impacts of shared mobility. I'll try and make it a little bit fun for you as well as we go. So these are the titles we will go through. I'll begin with a little anecdote and talk about forecasting and how we do it now and are we doing it right before we dive into the study itself. So here's a throwaway fact, the first one of the day. Oslo is in Norway and Northern Europe, and its coastline stretches further than Australia's. You wouldn't think so, but it does. And for centuries and centuries, the coastline has been pounded by the North Sea, by the Arctic Sea, eroding those cliffs as you see in that picture there. And I know what you're thinking. You're thinking the same as me. When will those cliffs collapse into the sea? And the reason I'm telling you this is many years ago, I was having a water cooler moment with a colleague who does coastal erosion. He models how quickly coasts erode, which clearly is not very quickly. You know, it takes centuries to erode away cliffs. And that's the point. His models don't have a base year of today. They have a base year of 200 years ago or more. They go back as far as the weather records go. And then they code in all of the weather that's happened over the last 200 years to reproduce the cliff's current state today. Now, there's a lot of variables to consider over the last 200 years, and then to project forward over the next centuries as well. A lot of variables. How do you do that? Well, you have to permutate and combine all of those variables many times and run the same simulations again and again and again. Thousands of simulations. And when you're running those simulations, it produces you a spectrum of results. And some of those results are extreme, but a lot of them will be reporting the same things, and you can start to understand which variables are important for this particular cliff you're modeling. So what's this got to do with transport? Almost nothing, except it piqued my interest because we don't do it that way as transport modelers. Generally, we follow a historical trend, and if we're lucky, we might predict 1, 2, or 3 futures: high, central, low, maybe a couple of variations around that. And we freeze a lot of what's going into those models. I've got 3 up there: household trip rates. So this is our propensity to travel, how many trips per day. The value of time, which we use in modeling, is a disbenefit. We don't like to spend time traveling, but we fix this. And whatever the value of time is today, we assume we fix it into the future. Car availability levels. We know that in many places around the world, car availability is changing. In car ownership might be dropping, but the availability of new mobility, ride share, car share, is increasing. But we generally fix those things as well. And you will notice with shared mobility or mobility as a service, on-demand transit, that there are things that are changing. The trends are changing. The adoption rates of these new mobilities. What is that? I don't know. If you consider pay-as-you-go travel, this may reduce car ownership. If you have an increase in choices of ways to travel, maybe your value of time changes. It's quite fun to ride an electric scooter around the town. And then, of course, increased inclusivity. So this is opening up choices to travel for people who don't own a car or don't have access to public transport. So I think to try and model new mobility in the future, we're doing it wrong. So I'm asking that question to the industry in general. Should we still be doing this when the future might be this? So this is a graph here. It's showing some big technology companies that we all know, and you'll see at the bottom the S&P 500. I'm assuming that's a kind of stock market. It's following a growth, a trend growth. It's pretty linear over the last 10 years. Microsoft is a kind of business as usual technology these days. It was one of the early entry ones. Same with Google, and their growth is reasonably linear. But then when you look at the new players, Apple, Facebook, Amazon, look at that. Who would have predicted that? To try and forecast these new technologies is pretty difficult. And jumping on the right one is a bit of a gamble. So we should be doing things a bit differently. Bucking the trend is what we should be doing. So I want you to just put your head in the clouds for a moment, and let's consider some future outcomes. And this graph we've got here has got two axes. One is on investment, increasing investment from left to right, and the other axis is looking at technology, from rubbish to the best. And we've got four future outcomes that we can consider here. And the first one is probable. This is where you really don't invest in much, and you're taking existing technology, and you're going to get a probable future. Business as usual. Then we have the plausible future, where if you spend as much money as you possibly can on all sorts of technology, you might arrive at something that is plausible. Hyperloop is one example, I suppose. It's plausible, it could happen, but really, I'm not sure it'd be a good business decision to do that. Then you have the painful one, which is where you invest heavily in the wrong thing. A good example is cable TV versus satellite. I don't know what it's like where you are, but in the UK where I live, they spent 5 years digging up the streets, laying cables, and then somebody launched a satellite in the sky, and we didn't need the cables. You don't want to back the wrong horse. And then, of course, the future that we do want is where you make the right investment in the right technology. And that brings us to the question of uncertainty again. As I was saying with cliff erosion, if you model things enough times with enough variables and combinations of those, you can start to map out the KPIs that are important, and you can start to see the distribution of those simulations and start to see where the reasonable outcomes lie. You can start to measure risk, manage risk, see risk. You can see the extreme outcomes. You can also measure if those outcomes are benign, they don't really matter, or whether they're catastrophic. In cliff erosion, catastrophic is it collapses. So this is what we need to do. So if you can get that kind of philosophy in your minds, then we can start to think about avoiding the pain. So I'm assuming that most of you on this call are transport modeling or transport planning background. So this is essentially how we're going to do it. Transport models are really a digital twin of a city or a place. And with the advent of big data, we can now make our models more and more informed. They can reflect reality in a better way because we can delve into the data, the underlying data. We've got more of it, and we can use that data to model and simulate our cities and places faster, more accurately than we've ever been able to do before. Data is it's a new technology in itself, and we need to harness that in a good way. And if we do harness that in a good way, then we can start to plan and predict more accurately into the future. And if we can plan and predict more accurately, then we can start to take care of the environment that we're going to live in. We can start to optimize and control. That, in essence, is what we are doing with our software in creating these digital twins. So this leads us into the Oslo study itself. Now, the purpose of this study is to look into a future where autonomous vehicles and MaaS, mobility as a service based car sharing schemes, have replaced your conventional private car ownership. MaaS, which stands for mobility as a service or on-demand transit, refers to a transportation system where users buy transportation based on their individual and current needs instead of using traditional transport options. So that means it's as you go, it's pay as you go. The report we prepared alongside Covey, an engineering consultancy based in Europe, this investigates some consequences of such a future for Oslo and the region around. I would say that experts differ on how the future of mobility will be and how soon it will come, but there is a consensus that with technological development, autonomous vehicles, and new mobility concepts, these will challenge the current transportation norms and the infrastructure and the urban development. This is without doubt. The Oslo study was launched earlier this year on the 11th of April after a one-year study. So where did we begin? Well, this study was inspired by similar studies in other cities, especially those from Lisbon. You may or may not have heard of the Lisbon studies. They are reasonably famous, prepared by the International Transport Forum, which is a forum signed up by 50 or 60 transport ministries from around the world. We carried out our calculations for different futuristic scenarios for the Oslo region by using a transport model in Visum, which was developed to analyze consequences of autonomous cars and MaaS systems. And a bit like the Lisbon study, we have based the calculations on the current transportation demand. So that's the demand of today. With this knowledge of the trips in Oslo and the surrounding area, we have simulated a future with a full implementation of autonomous vehicles in a shared fleet with and without ride sharing. This allows us to assess isolated effects of future transport systems and transportation concepts. And what we mean by that is, if we assume everybody switches to car share or ride share, the results are not blurred by those who are still driving around in their cars. PTV's involvement in these four reports you see here. In the beginning, we provided methodological advice on how you should model and reflect a shared autonomous vehicle fleet. And we were involved in some of those methodologies coming through the next three reports. In the last one, identifying the curve as an asset to be managed, I personally was a co-author of this report, and PTV did all of the simulation work behind it. So we're embedded into this topic for quite some time now. So let's look at some technological trends. There are some mega trends out there. We've got the technological development, which is, the advent of autonomous cars and connected cars. Urbanization, as people are moving into cities more and more all around the world, and climate change clearly is a big topic around the world as well. And how are we going to address that? And the transportation industry is a big contributor to that problem. We've got critical uncertainty here. Critical uncertainty is when you have unstable or unpredictable, such as consumer trends and consumer tastes, a bit like that technology slide I showed you before. Amazon is a big taste for us now in the way we shop online. These are critical uncertainties because we can't predict them. and it's really critical if the decisions you need to make are surrounded by that uncertainty. So this graph we've got here on the right is looking at two critical uncertainties. One is the citizen's preference, which is the horizontal axis, and this is showing the level of ride sharing. Do you want to be private, so not sharing, or are you happy to share? The vertical axis shows the market strength of public transport. Do we want to travel by public transport, basically? So if you put those two axes together, you can create four scenarios. We've labeled them 1A, 1B, 2A, and 2B. In scenario 1A and 1B, today's public transport users will continue to use public transport, while private car users will switch to the MaaS option. In 2A and 2B, all those people who are using the buses and trams in Oslo will also migrate to the autonomous vehicle fleet, which is going to provide an on-demand door-to-door service, a little bit better than public transport does today. In both of the A scenarios, so 1A and 2A, the vehicles will be shared, but not ride sharing. So the travelers are using the vehicles independently of other travelers, and when they finish their trip, the vehicle goes on to the next traveler. In the B scenarios, all the transport will allow ride sharing. So you will share the ride with other users who are kind of going in your direction. Here's our study area. We simulated the morning peak from 6 in the morning till 10 in the morning. The busiest scenario that we tackled, which is the 2B scenario, has got over 600,000 trip makers that we have to move into a shared mobility environment. So this is of a pretty large scale we're simulating here. So let's just try and visualize those scenarios a little bit more easily for you. Scenario 1A is where we remove car drivers and put them into car share. In 1B, all of the car drivers are now into ride share. With 2A, the tram and bus users join the car users into a car share. And in 2B, all of those people move into ride share. And the three options are a blend of the ones above, but I think we'll focus on the first four options really for the purposes of today. I'll just give you a heads up of the results. One of the biggest barometers of change that we can measure and we can understand is the change in vehicle kilometers or vehicle miles traveled by each of these scenarios. And the results are quite drastic. There is only one of those 6 scenarios where we actually reduce the number of vehicle miles traveled, and we only reduce it by 14%. And the worst case scenario, 2A, we almost double the vehicle kilometers traveled, which could never happen in reality because the roads don't have the capacity to do it. But these are big alarm bells, and we have to take care. If we let rideshare operators come into our towns and cities without regulation, then we will certainly be going in the increased vehicle kilometer direction, which is not really the ethos of shared mobility, I have to say. So how does Oslo compare? Well, the ITF also did some other studies. The Lisbon one is a famous one, but they did other studies as well. So just for comparison, you know, we're up there with the kind of number of population we're dealing with. One important thing to note is the population density in Oslo is low because it's got a lot of rural area surrounding Oslo up in the mountains, and density of travelers is quite crucial to the outcome you can achieve. This is a nice statistic to start with. The most optimistic scenario regarding the reduction of vehicle miles driven is a scenario where all car users start to share their rides, and the public transport users continue using public transport services, and that's scenario 1B. In scenario 1B, we can actually reduce the number of cars required to move those people around by 93%. That means we only need 7% of the existing cars to move people around. And it is pretty easy to do the math on that one. Your average privately owned car is traveling for 1 hour a day. So for 23 hours a day, it's doing nothing. These cars are traveling around all day. You know, they could be available or actually being utilized for 12 to 15 hours per day. So it's just a ratio of that, more or less. Our worst performing scenario is 2A, or 2B, to be honest, where the car and public transport people are all in car share only. It's not a very optimal solution. So 84%, as we got up there, is a huge reduction in the number of vehicles on the road. And how does that compare with the other studies done? Well, it's pretty comparable. Well, they're all above 90% reduction. I'm not sure I believe Dublin. That would suggest only 2% of today's cars are required to move everyone around. So each car in the system is doing the work of 50 cars today. That's a bit of a difficult one to believe. So now let's look at the vehicle kilometers traveled. I gave you a heads up a minute ago, the 14% reduction in scenario 1B. These are what we're seeing here. And here is the reduction in vehicle kilometers, and you can see our 14% in Oslo doesn't look very good compared to the other cities. The Lisbon one, which was done first, was showing a massive 55% reduction in vehicle kilometers. And you could think, if you're a mayor of a city, how much capital expenditure you could save if you did not need to build new capacity into your road network, because the advent of MaaS is going to save you. And a lot of politicians around the world are thinking this, but as we've increased our understanding of how these systems might work, we've improved the way we assess these systems. I got a bit more confidence in the 14% than I have in those other numbers. There are some circumstances that set Oslo apart. I mentioned the density of travelers across the area. It's quite low density, and this makes it actually quite difficult to use a fleet effectively, particularly when you consider the repositioning of vehicles. They're spatially spread out, so the repositioning between ride requests is a bit more of a factor in the Oslo area. Food for thought. Simulating the solution. So they were the headlines from Oslo. Let's go into the detail a little bit and just explain how we're doing this. So simulating shared mobility. The image you can see there is ride pooling as a mobility concept of the future. Let's just train our minds a little bit into the logistics center, the delivery sector. Let's think of Amazon. Actually, we talked about them earlier. How do they figure out which packages to put in which trucks, and then on which route to send those trucks in the delivery the following day? Well, the concept's pretty similar with on-demand transit, except you haven't got packages, you've got people, and you haven't got trucks, you've got cars or small transit vehicles. But the challenge is very similar, and the other dynamic that makes it a bit more complex is it's on demand. Generally, deliveries like Amazon, they know their requests for deliveries a lot earlier, because people make their purchases online, expect delivery in a few hours or a day's time. But the concept's very similar. So how do we tackle this problem? Well, we follow 3 rules that are written on the left-hand side there. The first one is very customer focused. We are trying to minimize the unserved trip requests. So we want to make sure everybody gets a ride. The second thing we do is minimize the fleet size required. This is an operator perspective. you know, we don't want to just flood the streets with the fleet. That costs a lot of money. So we want to minimize the fleet size while getting everybody a ride. And the third one is a bit of a variable. It's minimizing the objective function. And what do we mean by that? Well, we can take a holistic overview here. We've got three factors to consider. We've got the passenger factor. Let's talk about that. This is looking at the customer level of service. Us as travelers, we want a good level of service. We don't want to wait a long time for a ride to turn up after we've asked for one. We don't want to go on a long detour either, because if we're ride sharing, you will go on a bit of a detour. So we want to take care of journey times. And of course, we can also look at the fare as well. We want to make the fare fair. From the operator's perspective, they will want to know what their fleet size is to serve all those people. They will be interested in the vehicle utilization, so how many people are inside their vehicles. If they're doing rideshare, they want to fill the seats. They will be interested in the operating hours of that vehicle. How long is it running for? How long is it running with occupancy inside? How long is it running empty? You know, the repositioning of vehicles, and how many hours is it just sitting there idle through the day, not doing anything? And of course, they will want to understand their revenue business model factors. And then for the city focus, depending on what angle you're coming from, they will want to know if on-demand transit is going to relieve congestion or going to make it worse. I mentioned at the very beginning, climate is one of these mega trends. Can we reduce emissions with this initiative? Can we improve safety? These are all political topics that are all very important. And if we can make good progress, we also have the opportunity to redesign the urban realm, especially if we are reducing the amount of cars out there and creating space because we don't need so much parking, etc. You put all that lot together and you can start to make some sustainable decisions, because you're getting a much better understanding of all of these uncertainties. And talking of uncertainties, the service specification of the scheme you might put in place. Well, what sort of vehicle size should you go for? This is a variable that you can have. What is the pre-booking time of the customer? In Oslo, we said 1 minute. This is a very high level of service. It's just literally booking on demand. Other systems might require you need a longer pre-booking time so the system can organize itself. What is the maximum wait time that you should offer the customer? Could be anything. 5 minutes would be great. I'm not sure many people want to wait 20 minutes. We have to consider the pickup drop-off time. How long does it take people to get in and out of the vehicles? This will be a function of the vehicle design in a little bit, but it's also a factor in the journey time. If you're ride sharing, then every time you stop, that's part of your journey time. The fleet size. In Oslo, our fleet size in our best scenario was 20,000 vehicles, in the worst 56,000. But you can scale that back. Actually, you might have an operator who already knows how many vehicles they have or would like to invest in, so you can help them make those decisions. Then we have finally the detour. How much of an extension to the shortest ride time will we accept? 10 to 20 minutes longer than a sort of point-to-point journey time, or 1.2 to 1.5. You can make these numbers up. But these are all important factors that help shape the answer. So this is what we did. The top table kind of sets out the scenarios. The bottom table is actually counting the number of variables that we simulated. So we'll just pick out scenario 1B. We tested 9 different fleet sizes, 4 different wait times, and 8 different detour factors. And that actually, in combination with the way we put it together, was 21 different scenarios. But across the board, we had 62 scenarios. This is a lot different to traditional modeling, where we might just model 2 or 3. We had 62. Actually, we did about 300, but we repeated and honed. But the final analysis came out of 62. So let's look at some of these results we have here. The best and the worst case. We already know 1B was the best. We were reducing vehicle kilometers by 14%. Good old 2A is a disaster. It's where all of the car and private public transport people are riding in car share only. We almost double vehicle kilometers. And then if you look at the fleet size reduction, they're pretty good all round actually, but the best one was 93% in 1B. I mentioned empty vehicles earlier on, empty vehicles running around. We've got some here. In scenario 2A, 28% of the vehicle kilometers traveled were the vehicle being empty. Even in our best case, we still had 17%. That compares to the column right over on the left, the base reference case, which is just private cars as they are today, where of course there are no empty kilometers. So all of these empty kilometers are already, before you even consider how great the system is, these are already adding to congestion. So you have to remove these empty kilometers from the success of your solution before you actually start showing a benefit. There are other statistics there. I think we might be sharing these slides so you can ponder over some of these statistics later on at your leisure. The fleet utilization, this is a good operator perspective. How well used is my fleet? And we've got an occupancy of 1.62, generally well, it is the same across all of the rideshare scenarios, and that compares to an occupancy of 1.14 for today, which is a blend of driver and passenger composition. 1.62 doesn't look so good, but you have to consider that you've got 28% or whatever it was of empty miles, so that's reducing the occupancy, and of course there is a lot of time when the vehicle only has one person on board. We can calculate the whole distribution of occupancy actually, so we can delve into these numbers. On the flip side, when you go into the car share only, you actually reduce the average occupancy compared to today, and this is the empty mile factor really taking a hit on the numbers. Even when we have a semi-optimistic in option 3A, we still can't get as good as today. Depressing numbers. If we look at the vehicle operating distances, well, the left-hand column shows 12. This is the average distance the vehicles are traveling in Oslo for each trip, 12 kilometers. Well, now the vehicles are running around the clock, and you can see they're up by a factor of 10 to 15 longer in distance. So I said before that a vehicle is on average driving an hour a day. Well, if you're traveling 10 to 15 times further, then these vehicles are being utilized across a 24-hour period, 10 to 15 hours. In our 4-hour period, you can see that bottom line there is showing that the vehicles were operating about 3 hours out of the 4. So there's not all of the vehicles are in operation at 6 o'clock in the morning. You just bring them online as you need them as the peak grows. But there is also downtime in there where vehicles are in a place where they're not really required, and so they just wait a little bit of time for their next ride. But you know, that's, if you compare that to the existing situation where over a 4-hour period a car might only be in operation for 0.2 of the times, about 50 minutes, we can see the vehicles are being utilized reasonably well. Just as a side note here, the car manufacturing industry is really interested in this topic. We're working with several of them. They're thinking, hey, if the car ownership model is changing, who's going to buy my cars? This is a big worry for them. But actually, when you look at this scaling up of the amount of time the cars are on the road, the attrition rate of these vehicles is way higher than a car that we would own. And if that attrition rate is higher, it needs replacing more frequently. Of course, if you replace the fleet more frequently, you can bring in new technology more quickly, and you can see a situation where you could have a dominoes effect, or a snowball effect, sorry, where the momentum to jump on board this can build and build. Okay, where are we going next? Let's look at the level of service, and in particular journey times. So the average journey time in minutes in 2020 is about 12 minutes for each trip. When you go to option 1A, it goes up to 18 minutes. Now, 1A is where you're car sharing. So you are having the car to yourself. You go point to point, shortest route, but the extra 6 minutes is the wait time, because you have to wait for your ride. So that's the thing that makes it worse from today. But with ride sharing, the journey time goes up to 20 minutes, if you've seen under column 1B, 20.5 minutes. So now we have a blend of wait time and the detour time as well. Conversely, for the public transport user, their journey times on the very right-hand column, you see 31.6. That's the average time travelers spend in public transport, 30 minutes, 31 minutes. That reduces to 21. That's a big saving for public transport users. And this is a really important point, because the public transport journey time is saving by 30%. And you can imagine, and we've seen it, the early adopters of rideshare are going to be a higher proportion of public transport people, because they benefit the most immediately from the system. And that's not a reaction that we want to have happen, because we're actually wanting to get people out of their cars, not out of public transport. Customer level of service. Waiting time was one of the inputs. What sort of wait time should we give these people? Actually, we're finding in Oslo, most people don't wait very long, and you can see that from the distribution. They're waiting for less than 5 minutes, most people, and I think we said it as we arrived at the final wait time of 10 minutes. And then if we look at the detour as well, actually most riders are not really detouring beyond 5 minutes, and I think we can tolerate that. 5 minutes is 5 minutes, right? So we did some sensitivity analysis as well, and we started to turn up some of the dials a little bit to see what impact we could have. This is what I was talking about with the coastal erosion. You want to understand which parameters do something for you and which are benign and don't do anything at all. And we looked at two factors. We looked at the detour factor and we looked at the waiting time. So let's take the detour factor first. We can see in this middle column, we've turned the detour factor up to 2. So this would mean that a customer would accept a ride time twice as long as the shortest possible time. This is a variable from 1.5 that we had in the core test. This is the main reaction. We only need 20,000 vehicles to deliver the same number of people compared to 26,000 just by changing that detour factor. So already as an operator, you don't have to buy 6,000 vehicles. We also see that the vehicle kilometer changes were brilliant. We went from 14% saving to 31% saving. This is starting to get into the realm of those other ITF Lisbon studies. But you have to question it a little bit. Is a detour factor of 2 acceptable? And also, if you go for a detour factor of 2, it comes at a cost, because the journey time is increased. And it's increasing because if you look just below the minus 31%, you can see 2.48, That's the occupancy, the average occupancy whilst the vehicle is in operation. So we've increased the occupancy from 1.62 to 2.48. Great news for the operator. Will the customer accept it? Supply and demand question, isn't it? The second factor we changed was the waiting time, and we upped that from 10 minutes to 20 minutes. The longer in theory, the longer waiting time you give is the more flexible the system can be, the more chance the vehicles have got to get in position. But we actually found it made no difference. If you look at the statistics in this last column and compare them to the left-hand 1B column, it's pretty much the same. So for Oslo, the wait time beyond 10 minutes is a benign parameter, doesn't change a thing. So that means that when we're focusing in on more detailed analysis and operations in Oslo, we can start to focus on the detour factor more than being bothered by the wait time. And the reason why the wait time had no factor, I just popped up that graph there from the slide before, is that everybody was getting a really good level of service on wait time. So if you just increase it, you know, everyone's getting such a good service already, it's really having no impact. Another thing we looked at was actually the fleet size itself, and this graph you can see here, the projection of how large your fleet needs to be along the horizontal axis against the number of passengers served in the vertical axis. And you can see quite quickly you start to serve lots of people with quite a small growth in fleet. But you get to a point where you start to have diminishing returns, and it gets you need a larger increase in fleet size to serve a smaller increase in passengers. So let's think about that. The scenario we did was from that original 1B, we reduced the fleet size from 26,000 down to 22,000, down to 20,000. There is a repercussion. You don't serve everybody. So in the 20,000 fleet, you only serve 94% of the people. Now, I said at the beginning, one of the criteria is we want to give everybody a ride. But at what cost? At what cost to the operator? Well, the cost here is another 6,000 vehicles, which is almost 25% increase in capital cost in vehicles, never mind the maintenance and running of them. So you can save the operator a lot of money here. And those 6% who don't get served, well, they probably still could get served. They might just, if they're rejected, just change the time of day they wish to travel, or accept a lower level of service. So I'll just go on a slightly longer detour. So you probably find you will still serve them. So you can play around with these parameters here to hone and come up with the best optimal solution. Now we have to consider the impact on the city itself. This is a map out of Visam, and it's showing the V over C, volume over capacity ratios around Oslo. Red is pretty bad. So you can see there's a bit of red currently in Oslo already, which is why they're looking at this seriously. Then they want to get this down. But if you go to scenario 2A, it certainly does not go down. In fact, the whole place is a disaster, which we already knew. But there it is, illustrated before your eyes. This is scenario 1B, where we can actually show the green bands are the reduction in traffic. You would think you might see a reduction that was linear across the whole city, but actually in Oslo, and just the way it's spatially laid out and the gravitational pull of people from A to B, we've got a couple of corridors off to the east that really benefit from this solution, which is a great visualization for the router, the client, because they can start to consolidate and focus on those corridors, because there's a natural reaction to be found here, rather than try to do something over to the west where the reaction seems to be barely noticeable. Talking of linear relationships, is it the same across the whole study area? This is scenario 1B, and it represents the average wait time in seconds and we've got the scale down the right-hand side. What this is really showing is in the more rural areas, the average wait time is a bit higher. That makes sense. It's harder for the vehicles to get into place in those areas, so the wait times are naturally going to be a little bit higher. When we look at scenario 1A, where it's car share only, and this is going to measure against the same scale on the right-hand side there, everything's in the red. So the wait times go up quite considerably. So scenario 1A, from a personal, private perspective, you think, hey, I get the ride all to myself, but actually you wait longer for that ride to turn up. If you're ride sharing, the ride comes to you much quicker. Just to explain, in case you're wondering what PUDO means, PUDO is pick up, drop off. And these are PUDOs. That's a nice image there, Oslo from space. Each of these dots you see is representing a pickup and drop off location. So they're spread pretty generously across the whole study area. And the color of the dots represents the intensity of activity. So the red ones have got more PUDO action, more pickup drop-off action than the other ones. It's a reflection of where people live, where they work, and so on. What's important to note here, I don't know if you can see my mouse. Let's see if I can get my mouse. Yeah, right. In this area here, if you can see my mouse, is Oslo downtown. The railway station comes in here. And over the last 5 years, they've really tried to change the urban realm here to remove cars from this area. They've made it difficult to drive through, and it's a plaza area with buses and trams interchanging with the rail station. With the advent of rideshare, well, you want to interchange with public transport, so we've got the highest intensity clustered around here. The urban realm around that station probably won't be able to take all of that pickup drop-off activity. So that really does need to be thought about, which is what the fourth report from the ITF was all about, managing the curve. So let's look at the takeaways from this study. The first big takeaway that we had was there has to be a focus on increased coordination, and that coordination is between stakeholders, which might be technology companies, private sector, and of course politicians as well. They need to work together. Absolutely, we need to strengthen traditional public transport and integrate rideshare with public transport. They have to work together, otherwise they will be competing with each other, and it doesn't really help anybody. And the last point, which is could be contentious, is data sharing. You could imagine in any city more than one operator. They'll all be fighting for a bigger piece of the pie, but actually we can make the whole pie bigger if we share and we optimize the optimized. I don't know how that could be done, a city controller taking over, for example. Now I just want to say something here. The scenarios we did, they're designed to capture the outer boundaries or extremities of a future where all cars are fully automated. Further analysis on more realistic scenarios are needed to give an adequate tools for future planning. This study, for example, doesn't include a scenario where autonomous vehicles feed mass transit as a first and last mile service, which is something that we're more likely to see in the future. So what's next for Ruta, the public transport agency who commissioned this study? They've got some great policy insights from this study. They can compare it to the Lisbon studies. That's given them a lot of food for thought. They need to consider the availability of technology relates to point one, focusing on that coordination. They really do need to consider consumer preference. These are the critical uncertainties. How are we going to adopt this new mobility wave? And of course, business models. You want anybody who's coming into town to succeed. We don't want them there for a year and it fails and it leaves a terrible legacy behind. And of course, they will want to direct their public investment plans towards this as well. So actually, how are they doing that? Well, I can tell you they already have autonomous buses on the street in Oslo. They went on the street in May this year. They're just serving a corridor connecting the cruise liner sea terminal with the city centre. They're on trial at the moment, and I think they will start taking passengers later this year. These buses, they're not crawling along at 5 miles an hour. I think they're planning to run them at 30 miles an hour, although segregated. But the point is they're doing it. And this study that you see before you will be used to focus on corridors. It will be used to focus on feeder services, and it will be used to focus on correcting transport poverty, increasing inclusivity. And they will use this offline planning tool that we have here, PTV MaaS Modeller, to do that. And here is Maas Modeller, just a nice slide here to show you just a little bit what it looks like. This is taken from scenario 2A, of our worst ones. Let's just throw some statistics up here. In 2A, we've got over 500,000 trip requests. Each line you see in this box here represents one trip request. And we know for every trip request, the precise pickup location, drop-off location, and the time of day they wish to travel. This is our input to the system. And as an output in the top right-hand corner, we've got 56,000 vehicles produced to pick up those 536,000 people. And we've got 56,000 rows along here, which tells us everything we need to know about each vehicle. And then this box in the bottom right has got 37 million lines of data. Each line represents one leg of every vehicle journey, and a leg is between pickup and drop-off points. The map that you can see, the red fuzzy line is the route that one particular vehicle is taking, and the blue dots are the pickup and drop-off locations on that route. I think it's pretty fair to say that Router has all the answers with this immense amount of data that we are generating with our simulations. Really, it's just reminding ourselves, what was the question? And that is the end of my run through of the Oslo study. I hope you enjoyed that, and I'll hand you back over to Adam for questions if there are any.
Yeah, thank you very much, Paul. First question is, in the scenario where only 94% of the trips were served, have you looked at anything like allowing passengers to make transfers to help serve the rest of that demand?
No, all we did was identify how much of a reduction in fleet size or a saving in fleet size you could make, what would be the impact. Typically, the advice I've been giving in these desktop studies is try and create a fleet size that can serve 90% of your demand, and then let this system worry about the other 10%. What we have done in the past, actually, in one particular study, is we did a first pass, we served 90%, the remaining 10% we threw back into the system and said, look, will you take a lower level of service and see how many adopt it. This is a way we're thinking of tackling that one.
Okay.
We didn't do mode share. We didn't do choice, any mode choice analysis in this.
Okay. The next question is, Did you evaluate the cost of a trip versus average trip time? For example, longer trip, but no longer owning a car?
Yeah, I mean, I only presented here the average trip length. Of course, across the city, there are some journeys that are traveling a lot longer in time and distance. And so because we've got those 37 million lines of data there, we can actually do an analysis profiled across the trip length distribution to see if the longer trips are penalized more than the shorter trips. But I think what you'll find is that the shorter trips show a larger proportional increase because it doesn't take much to increase a short trip of 5 minutes to 10 minutes. It's only 5 minutes, but it doubles the journey time. So you can go to that level of analysis.
Okay. And I think that is it right now for the questions, and we're right on time, so we're going to go ahead and end it there. If you have any additional questions, feel free to email it in to info.us@ptvgroup.com. And as a reminder, you can go to ptvtraffic.us, and in the next day or so, this video will be posted, probably post a presentation as well as a link to the full study. And we will see you again next time. Thank you.
I just want to say one thing, Adam, before you close off. If you go to the PTV website, I don't know if the one in the US is different, but in the press room on our website, you will find the Oslo story, 3 or 4 stories down the list, and in there is a link to download the report if you're interested to download it. It's quite an interesting read, but it will give you more insight into the study and the things lying behind it.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Paul, and thank you for your presentation.
All right. Anytime.